Here's the argument. Premise 1, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur. 3, reasonable non-belief occurs. And so 4, no perfectly loving God exists. And therefore 5, there is no God. Michael J. Murray endorses the following argument against premise 2. 16. In the situation in question, that is, where God reveals himself in such a powerful fashion that reasonable unbelief is rendered impossible, persons would have strong prudential reasons for not doing wrong. 17. Because of the strength of these reasons, it would require little in the way of an act of will to do what is right. Where there is little temptation to do wrong, contrary desires would be overcome. 18. Where there is little temptation to do wrong, persons lack a genuine choice of destiny. And therefore 19. In the situation in question, no one would have a genuine choice of destiny. Immediately after stating this argument, Murray goes on to explicate the conditions relevant in an act's being coerced. A caveat here. It seems natural to me that for Murray's purposes 16 should be revised to say something like 16 prime. In the situation in question, that is, where God reveals himself in such a powerful fashion that reasonable unbelief is rendered impossible, persons would be coerced into always doing what is right. So about coercion, Murray thinks it comes in two forms, offerings or threats. His focus is on the latter. An act is coerced by a threat when a desire is induced by a threat, which desire is sufficiently compelling that it renders every other course of action except the coerced act ineligible. At least three factors, Murray thinks, can make desires induced by threats sufficiently compelling: threat strength, threat imminence, and threat indifference. Threat strength is the degree to which the consequences promised by the threatener for not bringing about the conditions required by the threatener is negative. If I'm promised an insult by a stranger if I don't give him my wallet, I will, all things being equal, keep my wallet. Threat strength is low in this case. The second condition, threat imminence, has three components. One is probabilistic imminence. This is the degree to which the threatened believes the consequences of the threat will be successfully carried out if the terms of the threat are not met. For example, if a serial killer came up to me demanding my valuables, I'll give them up. But if a 5-year-old did the same thing, I would keep my valuables. The difference in this case is the likelihood we ascribe to the threat being carried out, i.e., it's unlikely that the 5-year-old would be able to kill me, whereas it's much more likely that the serial killer could take me out. Temporal imminence, the second factor that determines threat imminence, consists in the amount of time from when the conditions of the threat are not met and when the threat is carried out. Temporal imminence is low, then, quote, when the threatened understands that there will be a significant lapse between the time he fails to meet the conditions of the threat and the time when the threat is carried out, end quote. Here's Murray's example. If we're threatened with receiving a powerful electric shock, immediately if we fail to hand over the money in our pockets to the threatener, we won't hesitate to hand over the money. But if, on the other hand, through some sort of delayed cattle prod, we were to receive this same shock a few years down the road if we didn't meet the conditions of this threat, most of us would not give our money away. Epistemic imminence is the third factor contributing to threat imminence. It is the degree to which the disutility of the threatened consequence is epistemically forceful. Here's a quote from Murray. To illustrate the role of epistemic imminence, consider the fact that massive advertising campaigns against smoking, drug use, and drinking and driving have been successful in reducing incidents of these behaviors. In all three cases, no one believes that the purpose of such advertisements is to convey information to the target audience that members of the audience don't already have. Instead, the goal is to make the disutility of engaging in that behavior more epistemically powerful. By repeatedly showing accident scenes strewn with dead or mangled bodies, students become more powerfully aware of how dangerous drinking and driving is. Along with these three components of threat imminence as well as threat strength, there is one more factor relevant in describing coerced acts, namely threat indifference. Here's Murray's example. Take an escape attempt by two prisoners. Let's say threat strength is the same. They both risk getting shot. Threat imminence is also the same. They think they have a 50-50 chance of escaping. The threat, if carried out, will be immediate in both cases, and they've seen the same exact escape attempts in their time in prison. We can see that one prisoner might be coerced into not making the escape attempt, while the other may not. The reason, says Murray, is that the latter prisoner is more threat indifferent than the former. And Murray proposes that threat indifference be described as, quote, the degree to which one finds pleasure in taking risks posed by failing to abide by the conditions of a threat, end quote. It is reasonable non-believers that have low threat indifference. So God, in not wishing to coerce them, has greatly lowered, for these people, threat strength and imminence, which entails granting less evidence of himself to these people.